This paper is really about big and familiar philosophical themes, about the public and the private, or the subjective and the objective. And I'm coming at it with respect to a particular problem that interests me as a philosopher of language, and that's the problem of how we reconcile the fact that we know what we mean in speaking, that we have, it seems, an immediate and authoritative grasp of the meaning of our words, and yet we don't seem to have that about other people's knowledge of their word meanings. And yet, in ordinary conversation, we go backwards and forwards, sufficiently happy that we are sharing an understanding and that we get what each other is saying. So here's the problem I want to concentrate on. It's about how we reconcile the inner and conscious dimension of speech, which I think is just a phenomenon, it's just a datum that when we conjure up words, and especially as philosophers, when we're trying to articulate our thoughts, or even perhaps when we're trying to write, we often weigh words in our minds and think which one is more apt, is more suitable, more appropriate to say what we're trying to say. So I think we have a sort of inner conscious awareness of the dimensions of meaning. And yet we have to reconcile that with speech's outer and public dimension, its availability to others. The fact that if I'm not wasting your time, there's something you're getting from hearing these noises now. So if what people mean by their words consists in, or involves at any rate, what they have in mind when they speak, then how can what someone has in mind, how can that be the meaning she or he attaches to their words, be also publicly accessible on the basis of mere behavior, of mere sound making? So what I'm claiming is we need an account that reconciles this inner conscious dimension of speech with its outer and publicly available dimension, how it's available in public practice or language use. So let's just call that the reconciliation problem. Here's just some familiar warming up. As I said, I take it that each of us is immediately and effortlessly authoritative about the meanings we attach to our words, and that we know what we mean by them as we use them. And I'm going to be principally focusing just on word meaning. However, we don't have immediate access to other people's conscious states and to the meanings they attach. Knowledge of their meaning, it seems, must go via something public and external. So we have an asymmetry here, the different way in which we access the meanings of our words and the way we access other people's. So if linguistic meanings are consciously apprehended by speakers, not this way available to listeners, how do we get first-person knowledge of what we mean to be what other people know we mean and what we know they mean by their words? Okay, that's the goal. Now, something standing in the way of the goal is the way philosophers talk about this stuff. Philosophers of language, not you good people in this room, of course, but the traditions we came from, they have often gone for very third-personal theoretical accounts of what the meanings of words consists in and how we in fact know the meanings of words. They study the behavior in groups of speakers, and classic accounts of that take a community, look at it externally, and try to resist any imposition of meaning that we would bring to bear, and try to extract or locate meaning just in patterns in the behavior or behavior and circumstances of the language users. So we've got Quine's radical translator, Davidson's radical interpreter, famous cases. So here's the issue, that third-person accounts of meaning leave out what it is to be a listener, immediately and consciously aware of meanings as one's receiving them or as one's using them. So we wonder how it can be that third-person accounts are capturing all there is to meaning if they tend to leave out something that seems to be a very large part of what it is to be a listener and language user. Just jogging the memory a little bit to show that not all philosophers have thought this way. Remember, Wittgenstein reminds us, round about Investigations 138, especially in 138, that there is that phenomenon of meaning seeming to be all there at once in the mind of the speaker. When we think of a word that we understand, the meaning seems to be all there. And yet, he asks, how can meaning be all there at once if it's also the unfolding of use through time? Now I take it that that's a version of the reconciliation problem. And I also take it that Wittgenstein would be a much less interesting philosopher if the answer to that question, how can meaning be all there at once, if it's also the unfolding of use through time, if the answer was it can't, that wouldn't have made him such a significant figure. So I think he wrestles with something of this problem all the way through the investigations. So we need an account that does justice both to the inner and the outer dimension of speech, and we need to find out how it can be that it's the very same contents that are being grabbed in both inner and outer dimensions. Now, let's just stress for a moment some of the virtues of this third personal account, this theoretical account of meaning, because it's not for nothing that it's held sway and had an importance in philosophy of language. One reason it has is because there's an important stress laid here on the publicity of meaning. So Quine tells us that all the field linguists can glean from observing speakers is all there is to the meaning of their words. And that the linguistic significance we can find has to be available in what's publicly shown from one speaker to another. So famous quotes, language is a social art, which we all acquire on the evidence solely of other people's overt behavior under publicly recognizable circumstances. In psychology, one may or may not be a behaviorist, but in linguistics, one has no choice. We depend strictly on overt behavior in observable circumstances. Key quote, there is nothing in linguistic meaning beyond what is to be gleaned from overt behavior in observable circumstances. So there's the insistence here that that's all meaning can consist in, that's all it can amount to, is the evidence for it publicly available in people's behavior. Now, Quine's reason for saying this, I think it is wrong, but I think it's wholly wrong, but Quine's reason for saying this is that he thinks that the theorist and the child are in the same predicament, that basically they're each exposed to the behavior of other people, and on that basis they have to work out what those people mean. But it's not true that it's the same project. The theorist who's studying a group of language users and comes equipped with theoretical tools with which to do this is not the same as the child. And equally, the thing that Quine leaves out in his story about language learning is the child. He leaves out what the child brings to bear on the original language learning position. Because if we believe and understand the kind of well-supported empirical discoveries of Chomsky that children probably come something like a universal language faculty and have to parameterize it to the particular linguistic information they're given around about the age of 20 to 24 months, then we know that the child is actually imposing something on the behavior they're getting and not simply trying to locate it in the surface of what they're getting. So equally, a theorist of language learning tries to work out what the child has and is equipped with to begin with that they bring to bear on the observable behavior in order to arrive at a language. Very different from the theorist who's not about that at all. Okay, so I think this is wrong. But the virtue of it is it just stresses something important about meaning having to be public. If it was utterly private and inaccessible, we wouldn't get a story about acquisition or communication going. So although I don't think that's right, what Quine is saying, I do think it's important to stress publicity. Word meanings not publicly available would not be communicated. Okay. Now, question is whether we have to go from publicity to something Quinean that Fullesdal says. I mean, Fullesdal, rewarmed Quine with modality, but here's the claim that I want to resist. When we want to understand meaning communication, we should not turn inward towards mental states, but outwards to what's publicly observable. And remember, Davidson, too, a great fan of this strong version of publicity, says, the semantic features of language are public features. What no one can, in the nature of the case, figure out from the totality of the relevant evidence cannot be part of meaning. Now, of course, Davidson and Quine use these theses of publicity, claims about the evidence for knowing meaning, to make metaphysical claims about the nature of meaning and the extent of meaning. So there's the move from epistemology to metaphysics here. And also they're going to claim that there's a certain indeterminacy, translation, inscrutability of reference, because no behavior of the kind they think is the only sort available can settle determinately the reference or translation between languages, reference of parts, translation between languages. Now, I want to concede something about publicity, but resist what I'm calling the externalizing move, the move that tries to locate meaning on the outside, in the behavior, on the surface of behavior. I want to hold on to the idea that meaning really is in the mind of the speaker and is a conscious inner phenomenon. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge something about publicity. So I do want to solve the reconciliation problem. In a way, I think these folks can't, because they just don't acknowledge one part of the problem. But here's all I want to mean by publicity. I want to mean by publicity simply that meanings are not wholly subjective and incommunicable. They're not private, they're not inaccessible. It must be possible in principle to know what someone else means, otherwise they're not meaning something in language use. Okay, so principle P is all I want to sign up for here. All a person can mean is all he or she can be known to mean. And of course, known to mean by others, relevant qualifications go in there. But notice that that view of publicity is very minimal. It's very minimal. It rules out essentially subjective, private notions of meanings. Publicity of that sort ensures that other people can know what you mean, if you mean anything at all in speaking. But it doesn't commit us to that stronger interpretation, what I'm calling the externalizing move. The minimal understanding says that it's possible to know what people mean. It doesn't say where meaning is displayed. That's something else. That's something additional. And we want to understand a little bit of diagnosis here. Why is it that people who've subscribed to publicity have effortlessly moved to something stronger, to this idea of meaning externalized, meanings being somehow out there? Well, here's a sort of shot at people who've taken this stand. And there's an irony here. A person who's deeply Quinean in some sense is John McDowell. Irony, right? No more mentalist than he, and yet he's sufficiently a student of the Quinean tradition to believe that we have to take this externalizing move. Here's the way McDowell comes at it. If the meanings people attach to their words were residing solely in the minds of individuals, there would be no knowing for sure what other people meant when they spoke to us. Working out what others mean would be, as John McDowell puts it, a mere matter of guesswork as to how things are in a private sphere, concealed behind behavior. Now we're to understand that's very, very bad. Right? Now, it is a hopeless picture, notice. It is a hopeless picture. For a start, phenomenologically, it's right off key. It doesn't feel like that. You don't hear noises and speculate about what somebody might mean unless you're a Brit in Paris, listening to, who's got schoolboy French and everybody else is speaking smart postgraduate French, and you're just listening to noises. But when you're talking to somebody in an easy flow of conversation, it's certainly not the case that ordinary speech works by hearing noises and guessing what's going on behind that behavior. Another person who goes for this view is Michael Dummett. Any hidden significance that a speaker attached to a word could not be part of its meaning. Dummett claims no part of an expression's meaning can contain anything which is not manifest in the use made of it, laying solely in the mind of the individual who apprehends the meaning. Now, manifest is key there, by which Dummett means it's got to be manifest in behavior. In fact, behavior describable without reference to the contents of the words themselves. Now, it's a short step from this idea that our only alternative to thinking that meaning is available is thinking it must lie solely and privately in the mind of an individual and be a matter of guesswork. It's an easy step to just think these are the only alternatives and then to force meaning out there. That's exactly what McDowell, Dummett, and others do. So the short step they take is to this. The significance of others' utterances must, in general, lie open to view in publicly available facts about linguistic behavior in its circumstances. The key difference from Quine is, of course, Quine wants to locate meaning in the behavior, McDowell does too, but the behavior for McDowell is rich. Okay, it's significant behavior and not mere physical movement type behavior. Okay, but nevertheless, it's out there where the meanings are to be found. So how did we reach that position from publicity? Well, it's that idea that the only way to resist private meanings is to go public and suppose meaning is located on the surface of speech. That's what I'm calling the externalizing move. Or I'm going to call it not externalizing, exteriorizing. It would be nice to call it external. But the word external has been used for all sorts of other purposes that you're very well aware of. So we have to invent this other term, externalizing, barbarism. So the question is, my question is, does denying the essential privacy of meaning require the strong exteriorizing reading of publicity? Notice if the answer was yes, then the reconciliation question is impossibly difficult, too acute perhaps to solve. So if we had to locate meaning out there, there might be no way of getting the reconciliation problem satisfied. So here's the question. How can meaning be all there in the mind of a speaker if it lies open to view on the surface of linguistic behavior, echoing the Wittgenstein worry? Well, first of all, notice that P says nothing about what makes meaning available, what makes meaning available to one another. It certainly doesn't talk about it being present on the surface of speech. So we don't need to go from P to the exteriorizing move if there's a way to get publicity satisfied without locating on the surface. If there's a way to do that, then we can do it. But that way to do it must resist the hopeless picture McDowell talked about. There is another way to go for publicity, and this is McDowell's way of going, and some of you already have had that in mind, so we should just put it up there and I'll tell you why I don't like it. So a different way of satisfying publicity is John McDowell's way, where he says this, and I think this is phenomenologically dead right. From the point of view of the listener, listening to speech, quote, our attention is drawn to something present in the words, something capable of being heard or seen in the words by those who understand the language. There's something right about that phenomenologically, that when you hear these noises, you don't hear them just as noises, I hope. If you do, I'll just wave. But you hear the meaning that comes with them. That's why it's so annoying, for me at any rate, when I'm sitting in some nice Paris cafe and doing some philosophy and I'm hearing the chatter of smart Parisian voices, almost unintelligible to me. And then, it's suddenly interrupted by a Brit saying, oh, it's very expensive, Paris, isn't it? And you don't get a nice cup of tea, and you think, oh God, I have time to move, gather up your stuff, go to the next cafe. It's annoying because you can't turn those noises back into mere noise. You must hear meanings in them. You have to hear what's being said. So phenomenologically, McDowell's right. But is the phenomenology a guide to the epistemology? I think not. McDowell wants to read it as epistemology. He wants to say the reason we hear meaning in people's words is because the meaning is there in people's words, and understanding is a form of direct perception. It's a direct perception of the external world. You're just perceiving what's there on the surface. But for that epistemology to be as easy and straightforward as McDowell wants, we have to have a very bizarre metaphysics. We have to have the world of noises and sounds populated with meanings which lie out there with their significance resonating on their surfaces. They've got to be parts of people's conscious mental life, remember, that are kind of there for the immediate taking, for the immediate appreciation of those in a position to perceive them. The significance of others' utterances in a language must, in general, lie open to view in publicly accessible facts about linguistic behavior and its circumstances. So how does McDowell reconcile that with what he calls, his term, the interiority of mind? With the fact that we do have an inner life and that that's where meaning is. And remember, he does think that's where meaning is. Because he says, knowledge of meanings is wholly a matter of how things are in a subject's mind. Now, how does he reconcile that with meaning being there on the surface? Well, famously, here we go. This is the best short version of McDowell's philosophy of mind and language. Quote, command of a word's meaning is a mental capacity. The mind is the locus of our manipulations of meanings. Meanings are in the mind, but, as Putnam's argument establishes, they cannot be in the head. Therefore, we ought to conclude the mind is not in the head. Okay. Hey, easy as that. Now, some of us want to find this a little bit bizarre. Recognizing others' meanings is recognizing what they have in mind, but it isn't hidden from us, because the mind, of course, isn't in the head. The mind is in the world, and you can actually see minds and bits of minds. It's a conscious life out there. The outward aspect of linguistic behavior is essentially content involving. So the mind's role in speech is on the surface. The mind's role in speech is on the surface. Okay. So can we directly observe the inner lives of others? Are conscious phenomena directly observable features of the world? Well, I find that metaphysics just too odd, too unusual to really stomach. And it doesn't help the kind of magical nature of this picture. There's a kind of magic here where, the surfaces are meaningful and people are just sort of seeing these glittering surfaces. It doesn't help me any to take the word magical and replace it, as McDowell does, with the word enchanted. I mean, that doesn't help. Those are close enough in my lexicon. They're close enough for me just to think I'm not getting anywhere, right? Do we have to have that picture? Well, I don't think we do have to have that picture. And besides, there are various things that I'm going to say when I offer my alternative that I think are wrong with it, and various things I think it gets wrong. But the question is whether we can hold on to McDowell's phenomenological intuition, that we, as it were, hear meanings in words, which is right, resist the epistemology, have publicity, have meanings be conscious. Okay. So we want an alternative. And I'm not going to give you it straight away. I'm going to warm you up for it a little bit. So we've got to, remember, we've got to secure the phenomenological datum, meet the publicity constraint, resist the exteriorizing move. That's what we've got to do. And we've got to do this in such a way that we credit ourselves. We can be credited with knowing what other people mean, not just, as it were, supposing, but knowledge of what other people mean from this point of view. It's got to be that the first-person point of view is the primary perspective. I want to say that first-person knowledge of meaning has got to be the basic. It's got to be prior, and it's got to be on that foundation that we understand what other people mean from the first-person point of view. So, a word of warning before we go on with this. To make the first-person point of view central or primary is not to say that we're infallible. I mean, to say we're authoritative, of course, is not to say we're infallible. There are ways in which we can be wrong about what we think we mean by our words, and ways in which we can be wrong about our own competence. Okay, so it has to be conceded right off. Because of that, it has to be conceded that it's not that whatever we take ourselves to mean is what we do mean. This is not a Humpty Dumpty theory. It's not as though whatever impressions of meaning I have constitute the meaning of my words. There's got to be a real achievement somehow in meaning something from the first person point of view, even though it feels effortless. One's got to explain how there can be laying claim to a fact there about meaning something. Now, just to show you a little bit of fun, just to show you that we are not infallible, here are two types of mistake. One type of mistake is where we have an impression that we can mean something, we think we know what we mean, but in fact it's an illusion of meaning. And the favorite sentence for this is, many more people have been to Paris than I have. Trips right off the tongue, seems okay, but a moment's thought you'll realize it's garbage, it's unintelligible. But I invite you to try it out with friends, just, now that you're here, we visitors, we should just say to people, well, many more people have been to Paris than I have. They won't bat an eyelid. Now, there's obviously an impression that means something, and there's a sort of immediate take on it, but it's actually an illusion of meaning. And of course, we can also have illusions about our competence, and I can't resist, I think Gloria's already heard this, but I can't resist telling the rest of you, because it was a grad student of mine that found this. I thought it was so wonderful. So the second kind of failure about the limits of one's competence, judgments of one's competence, is to be given by an example from an obituary in the Times newspaper. It was an obituary for Sir Nigel Strutt, 10th of February 2004. Here's what the obituary writer says about Sir Nigel. So Nigel was mistakenly proud of his linguistic ability, professing to speak fluent French, Italian, and German. In fact, it was his personality and confidence, rather than his knowledge of languages, which enabled him to converse with his many friends abroad. I think we all know Englishmen like that, right? So Nigel's just, you know, exactly what some of us remember encountering. It reminds me of John Julius Norwich's description of another kind of Sir Nigel character when John Julius Norwich first came to Paris. He remembers standing on the Gare du Nord where people were having their trunks kind of, you know, relayed by porters, and a porter was looking for a tip, and an Englishman was shouting at the porter, "No, no, no, je pays Cooks, Cooks pays you." And that's sometimes the nearest some of these Englishmen come to French, but okay. So there can be illusions of competence, and there can be illusions of meaning. So first person point of view is not infallible and not constituted by one's impressions of meaning. So what is it that one's actually getting hold of? What is it that an individual's actually getting hold of as a fact about meaning from the first person point of view? Well, I think the story of that has got to start with an individual's acquisition of meaning. We've got to go back to how individuals acquire meaning. And here we get, surprisingly I think, from Donald Davidson, a key insight. I mean, Davidson, who's usually regarded as an essentially third-personal philosopher of language, I mean, the work that I think many of you know from the Jean Nicod lectures on triangulation, he was reaching, feeling, sensing for something more rooted in the individual's point of view. But here he says something I think really useful, and of course he takes this to be a consequence of Quine's meaning as use thesis. He thinks this is the real point of meaning as use. Someone who is consciously teaching a beginner the use of a word may think of herself as simply passing on a meaning that already attaches to the word. But from the learner's point of view, the word, the sound, is being endowed with a meaning. That's the important point. That a lot of philosophers do regard the idea of meanings in a public language as being sort of around there and grabbed and made use of. But this is a very good insight that really from the language learner's point of view, the individual themselves has to invest that sound, endow that sound with meaning, invest that sound with meaning somehow. And I think we've got to recognize that investing the sound with meaning is a very different picture from recognizing something there on the surface of speech. I mean, if we're endowing it, then it's coming from inside. It's coming from inside the house, as it were, right? That one is making something of the sounds one encounters. Now, if we can tell a story about how that's done, and then tell a story about why that will be a basis for knowing what other people mean, we're home and dry. Notice that McDowell's problem, one of McDowell's problems is that since he doesn't want that picture, he does think that the language learner is in fact coming to recognize, take hold of a meaning that's already present. He's got to tell us how we go from being in a position of merely encountering sounds to suddenly perceiving meanings. Now, of course, it's at that point McDowell refuses, and on principled grounds, refuses to give an explanation. We get the famous phrases, you know, light dawns gradually over the hall. It's like the turning up of a lamp. And as I'm always parodying him, saying, you know, try going to the CNRS or to the British Academy and saying, I want to do 2 years of work on how it's like turning up a lamp, or, you know, it's just like sort of water running over the sand. It's not going to cut the mustard, right? You're not going to get the grant money. So McDowell doesn't have a story about language learning, is one thing. But McDowell also says, he says, here's what we must answer, a difficult question. The difficult question is, how can mere training, mere drilling, he says, in a behavioral repertoire, extend one's perceptual capacity to see meanings? I think the answer to that is clearly it can't. Right? Mere drilling in a behavioral repertoire can't extend one's perceptual capacities. So we need an explanation. There isn't one from McDowell. We should prefer an account that gives us an explanation, if an explanation can be had. Okay. Now, how are we going to get this account to go? How can we hear meanings in people's words based on the meanings we've attached to them and still claim to have knowledge of their meanings? Well, I think an account that starts from the first person point of view is going to have to go something like this. My knowing what I mean by my words has got to be the primary and basic case, and I have to rely on just that to know what you mean. So how can I do that? Well, somehow we go, I take my words to mean such and such. Now there's got to be why my taking my words to mean such and such is them having those meanings, right? We've got to get from merely taking a word to mean something to it having a meaning, but that's what's going on first. And then in hearing you utter those words, I take you to mean such and such as well. In other words, I take you to mean what I mean by them. And the key here is going to be that the only meanings I can give to your words are the meanings I can give to those words. The meanings I hear you as saying are the meanings I attach to those sentences and words. If you use a word which is ambiguous and has another meaning for you, if I don't have that other reading, I cannot hear that meaning in your word. Okay, I can't hear that meaning. So if any of you go to Glasgow and my hometown, and you go into a shop and you buy something small, the sales assistant might say, "Would you like a wee poke?" Now, when they say, "Would you like a wee poke?" some of you will think, this is kind of rude and a bit, kind of all sorts of things you might think. Of course, they mean a paper bag, but to me, it's very easy to hear that. To you, you won't hear that meaning. The only meaning you can give to it are the meanings that you associate with it. Straight away, of course, you might do some inference and working out, but on the immediate hearing a word with significance in the way that we said we don't just hear sounds. You can only hear the meanings you give the words. So I take words to mean such and such, and I take you to mean what I do by them. And the question is, how can we account for what's going on in A, and how can we establish that B provides me with an entitlement to claim knowledge of what you mean, as opposed to merely conjecturing it, right? So this is where the dubious epistemology's got to come in. We need a three-part account. We need A, an account of what it is to take words to mean something. Then we need an account of our epistemic entitlement to claim understanding of others on the basis of our own understanding. And then I'm going to claim that the way that the epistemology works relies on an analogy between use and understanding with looking and seeing in perception. Okay, the first part, taking our words to mean something. I take it that when a child endows a word with meaning, from what we know about child development and language acquisition studies, Dare Baldwin's work and various other people, Bloom and others, we know that children tend to, especially for early word acquisition, very, very sort of primitive, ostensive learning, as it were. Children tend to learn what words refer to under conditions of joint attention between the parent and the child and the object. And joint attention, as you know, is not that you both happen to be looking at something. It's the fact that the infant will sort of gaze at the direction of the mother's eyes and be looking at something. The mother will be checking whether or not she's talking about what the infant's looking at. Under those conditions, one might think there's a kind of coordination of experience of these two. And that when you introduce a sound, it's a kind of sound label commemorating, as it were, the experience that you're jointly having. One can recreate that again and again in the presence of the object, and then eventually, without the object present, the mere sound can recreate the experience. And I really do think that for early word meaning, experiential dimensions of word meaning are important here. And the idea of not just remembering the experience, but as it were, recreating it, suggests that what speakers are doing, I think it's largely what speakers are doing, is they're trying to, as it were, reconfigure one another's experience until they come into a coordination, to be both experiencing and thinking in the same way, or relevantly congruent ways of something else. One is trying to get other people's experience into a certain shape in which they can have a perspective on what you're talking about that you have, or a close enough perspective. But if joint attention is important, and this coordination of experience between speaker and hearer, or teacher and learner, is important, then you'll see that taking a word to mean something is not something you do in isolation. It's not something you do by yourself. It actually does already involve others. And as long as one's externalist about the experiential dimension, involving an object, involving another. I mean, this is as it were, Davidsonian triangulation with a human face, with an inside to it. You wouldn't like any of this talk, but it's finding something inside the triangular situation here. If that's right, then meaning something has already some sort of publicity. It already has a dimension of other involvingness and object involvingness in the basic cases of referential learning, meaning of referential words. Now, there's a certain amount of hand waving that I could go in for, but I want to cut to the chase because I think the next bit's the more important part. But notice that taking words to mean something isn't a matter of a private, subjective experience constituted in isolation from other people. To take a word to mean something does require certain conditions involving others, involving commonly perceived objects, and so on. But the thing I'm really interested in is this second part. How can, if I have succeeded in giving a meaning to a word, how can I be entitled to know what others mean just on that basis? How at all could that be the case? Well, here's the way I think it's supposed to work. So I take word W to mean M, and I take you to mean what I mean by word W. I take you to mean M. And the issue here is about how I make transitions of this sort. How do I make these transitions? So I take my words to mean something, and I just automatically take you to mean what I mean. But why is my taking you to mean M by your use of W giving me entitlement to claim knowledge that you mean M by your use of W? It looks as though we would have to get from my supposing that you attach a significance to a word to some sort of argument that shows that I'm entitled now to move to you do attach that significance. And how can I do that? I mean, that looks like the first third person divide, writ large, impossible to solve without, theory or something else, lots of evidence. Well, notice I could make the transition from 1 to 2 if I had 3. Anyone who uses W means what I mean by it. But of course, how do I arrive at 3 without having made sufficiently many inferences from 1 to 2 in enough cases with enough people to now get a little induction going so that I can conclude anyone who uses the word means W by it? Well, of course, and this is nothing up my sleeves. This is where we use the Wittgenstein uncertainty theory of knowledge, as it were, reheated by Crispin Wright. And we suppose, look, we don't use inferences from 1 to 2 to arrive at 3. We have to take 3 for granted. 3 is, if you like, a hinge proposition, or it's a cornerstone of linguistic practice. Were 3 not an assumption that we were entitled to, we would never get from 1 to 2. Now the question is 3 an assumption we're entitled to? And the answer is yes, as a default assumption. If the default assumption is that, to begin with, the child can assume, and the assumption here is not, as it were, something fully entertained and thought out in the context of other options. It's, as it were, the natural starting point to assume that anyone who uses this noise means what I mean by it, because when you learn the noise with the mother and attach and endow and invest a meaning with it, and other people come along and talk to you and it goes reasonably well, there's no reason to suppose that other people would attach any other meaning to that. The meaning you attach is the meaning anyone attaches to it. You're not figuring out or even inferring. It's just an automatic assumption. Now, if that's the default assumption, and we've got the default, then at least in default cases, when you're talking to the small community of people with whom you grow up and in whom you're in immediate conversation, it's okay to use that. It's all right to use that. It's in place, and that will guarantee you the move from 1 to 2. And in fact, I want to claim we make the move from 1 to 2 in virtue of 3 without anything like conscious inference. It's just, as it were, how we get it. So why assume that is the default? Well, because I think we're built that way, and I think we can get a nice analogy, as I want to finish with the looking and seeing case. Here's something that works in a sort of similar way before the language situation. is established. Where there's a looking, there's also a seeing. Where somebody's looking and they're a normal perceiver, they're having an experience of seeing. And it's as if we know those two go together and we can read from one to the other effortlessly and without conscious inference. So for example, Sean Kelly sitting in the corner there, he suddenly looks out the door, he looks round and out the door, his attention is caught by something. I think, what has Sean seen? To know that, I turn my eyes in the direction of gaze of Sean's gaze, and I just read me for him. Now I'm looking at something, I think, that's what Sean's seen. As if I assume we're sufficiently similar perceptually, that if Sean's looking somewhere, and I can't, as it were, have his experience of seeing, that if I look in the same place, and I have an experience of seeing, I just take it, that's what we're both seeing. It's what is seen when looking there. And we do that effortlessly and automatically, and that connects first and third person experiences very easily. So I don't observe my own looking, I just see. I don't enjoy your seeing, but I can see where you look. And by reading from one to the other, I can get a very, very easy way of claiming to know, and in certain default cases I do know what someone else has seen. Now, notice that looking and seeing analogy works as long as we're in sufficiently similar perspectives, and of course there's nothing occluding one of our views of the object. So now children have to learn that. Children are very egocentric to begin with, so they just assume that whatever they're seeing, anyone else is seeing too. You know, whether you're looking the other way, whether you're sitting on the other side of the room, they tend to just assume other people will have the experience that they have. And it's a good assumption. That egocentrism does them well to bind them to other people, funnily enough, and then they have to learn later to correct for perspective. Now, I think something similar goes on with language, because I want to say that there's the same analogy between use and understanding. I can't have your conscious experience of understanding, but I can observe your use of language. Similarly, I don't observe my own use, I understand when I speak and when I hear. Now, if I think the two go together, then whenever I hear a use of a word, it comes backed by the understanding I attach to that word. That use has that understanding. And I read me for you, or you for me, right? They come together. But without my actually having to make a sort of inference to cross a gulf or a bridge, the use of that word just is a use with an understanding it has for me. Later on, of course, rather like correcting for perspective, I have to learn not everybody attaches the same understanding to the use of that word that I do. It's a great shock to badly linguistically trained British subjects when they go abroad, and at the age of 4 and 5 you hear people making noises in playgrounds that they can't understand, and they talk to these kids and nothing happens, and they're really puzzled. It's quite a shock to learn that use and understanding could come apart, or that somebody could be making noises that are not invested with the speech significance they have for you. But if use and understanding do go together like that, then in the default case, it's okay. They really do. For the small community of people who use words with you, in concert with you, and perhaps from whom you had the right experiences to endow words with meaning, your understanding will attach the same significance, or near enough to the significance they attach, to be able to get on with the job of communicating with them. Thereafter, of course, you will have to do some linguistic work. But now we can see why, I hope, you can see why, insofar as I take words to mean something, I take anyone to mean the same by those words. And notice how easy it is to slip from anyone means this by the word to that's just what the word means. It's as if the great kind of illusion is that words really have meanings, as it were, on their own, because we don't distinguish between anyone who uses that word means by it and that's just what the word means. And of course, from the first person point of view, there is no such difference for me until I learn to adjust my usage to the interference of other people outside the linguistic community where the default doesn't hold. So I now think we have a sort of, we've got the materials for a decent solution to the reconciliation problem. We can base it on the first person case. It's phenomenologically salient in hearing people speak that we attach the significance we give to those words. The meanings are our meanings. Who else's meanings would they be? But it sounds as though we hear them, as it were, out there, because there's no difference between a word when used by me or anyone else, at least in the default case. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, you seem to take for granted that indeed we have this subjective access to the meaning of our words.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to challenge that.
I thought you would.
Okay. Well, another possible view, which I think is more realistic, is that we have access to a contribution, conscious access, normal, to the contribution that a word makes to the interpretation of an utterance in context, which can vary or not vary, but it's not the same thing. And that in fact word meanings, as a kind of stable linguistic property and semantic property attached to words across their uses in context, is part of our psychology, but at a subpersonal level. We don't have any immediate conscious access to it. In fact, we have to work hard, and not always successfully, to know what words actually mean for us. So
I think that can't be right. I mean, I know you think that, but I think that can't be right. I mean, look, surely you too have had the experience. I mean, maybe this fits your first kind of option. You said that we are aware of the contribution that words make. As long as that's not subpersonal, but there is an awareness of the contribution they're making to the interpretation of the utterance. Okay. The question is whether the awareness of that is coming from or in accordance with or resonating with something else, or whether it's somehow just free floating.
No.
But when we, when we are trying to compose a sentence or we're trying to express something, trying to get something across, and we think which word is best to capture the nuances. We do weigh words in our minds. We do have that experience of saying this word rather than that would really say it. This is more apt. Now, what are those intuitions responding to? It certainly doesn't feel to me like it's something subpersonal. It doesn't feel as though I say, he was intransigent or intolerant. He was, wait a minute, intransigent. How did that sound? No, intolerant. How's that? No, I don't wait and see how I do by letting my subpersonal machinery just fire. I kind of take these two words and I kind of hold them up and, I'm intuiting something. And people have got very fine judgments about this. They can tell whether or not one word is stronger than another. They can tell whether or not it's, it's more damning. They're aware of inferential relations when you use one word in a sentence rather than another word. Surely that stuff is to do with conscious awareness of the meanings of words.
No, not surely, come on. Don't take out the surely, there's nothing sure about that.
What's going on there, though?
Yeah, exactly. What's going on there is that you have different intuitions of a contribution each one way or another would make to an utterance you want to speak about someone.
Right. Contribution in virtue of what?
In virtue of its meaning, which is a stable feature, but for which you have no direct conscious access.
But this is odd because
when you're prepared. When you're speaking, I mean, us who write philosophers, we may spend a lot of time thinking about one word and another. The normal flow of speech is not like that at all. Mm-hmm. There's very little hesitating between two words, and when there is very little evidence that one kind of envisage the full meaning in any sense of a word, or the effect that I'm using this word rather than the other will have on my audience, and will it convey what I want to convey, my speaker's meaning. First thing. Second, when you do have this kind of comparisons, again, there's nothing sure that what you're looking at as word meanings as opposed to the contribution the words using one or another would make to a given utterance or to a type of utterance. Sure. And how do you know about that? Because the subpersonal psychology determines your personal psychology.
But look, this looks like a rope trick to me, because you're talking about being aware of the contribution. But the contribution of what? I mean, the contribution is that word has a particular significance for you, which the other word differs from or varies from.
Fit in the context. It will fit in the context, given the rest of the utterance, given who your audience is, given the background knowledge that will be accessed, and all that is present in your mind directly.
Choosing those words, finding those words, can't just be a matter of, randomly running through the subpersonal to see, how it turns out. Look, here's another phenomenon, Dan. Look, just separate from some sentence contexts. So I say to you, do you know the meaning of the word pleached? If I say that to people, they either do or don't. If they don't, it's just a sort of new sound. But if it's a word you know it. You're kind of aware of it. You're aware of, and what isn't the case is that it's part of your subpersonal psychology. So if I say to you, do you know the meaning of the word pleached? You don't say to me, well, let's take it for a spin and see how I do. Let's use it in a few sentences. Oh yeah, look, it seems to kind of go here. Right. So there's something you're aware of which is not utterly subpersonal here, and it's coming to you, as it were, as Wittgenstein says, meaning's all there at once. It either has an inside or not, that word. For those of you who don't know what it means, it just means that, pleached. So hedges are pleached. Hawthorns are pleached, you kind of interlace them like that. But pick your favourite word. But that's not right. So it's not that you don't know whether you know it until you try it out by firing up your subpersonal mechanisms.
I'll stand by my story and just make the last point. If you take that, if you look, there's an alternative to exteriorization versus that's distributed cognition and going through all the cognitive process inside and outside the individual, and with at least two individuals involved. So you have a coordination problem which is solved by processes which are inside at least two people and their common environment. So that's where you have to look at. So it's neither an internal story nor an external story. It's a nice mix of both, a distributed cognition, and where you indeed look at processes, there is no pride of place to conscious or personal process opposed to
I'm not so opposed to that. I mean, it's really the exteriorizing guys I'm after. I mean, there's something about that's fine, because I also have lots of connection with other people in external environments. That sounds sensible to me, yeah, sure. But you're putting in something which goes against the whole thrust of kind of the view I'm establishing, and I just want to put the brakes in at least to say I don't understand it at all. This talk of I know that you're speaking English because wait. My job now. You can reload and let me just get this out. So there is this worry that we can ease everything by just talking about knowing English or knowing the language. It's exactly
not everything,
but a hell of a lot, and it's
a hell of a lot. But
I think it's actually nothing at all. I think it's nothing at all. So this idea that somehow we reach for the language, and you know the meaning of the language, and you know what I mean because you know I'm speaking the language, and you know the language. If you could give me a satisfactory metaphysics and epistemology of my knowing the language, then maybe we get somewhere. I don't think you can. I don't think you can. In fact, I don't think there's one to be had. And actually, any amount of empirical linguistics will show that it's a fiction, it's a fantasy. This idea of the language. In any way of trying to make that. More definite. No, it's not a sidetrack. It's not a sidetrack. No, I'll tell you why it's not. It's not a sidetrack because given that I think you've got no grounds in which to make appeals to such a thing as knowing the language, then the problem has to be addressed in the direction I'm going in, which is how do I invest words that people around me produce with significance? How does that count as knowing the meaning of their use of those words, right? And there is no prior account that helps itself to a fantasy, mythical object of English and says that I know that.
By your own account, I mean, I'm fluent in English, but I'm not fluent in French. Same goes for you, right? And therefore, we can just, chat away in English, right? But if we switched over to French, it would, break down now and then.
We can chat away because our idiolects overlap enough, though.
Well, that isn't.
I would like to come back to your own view on what you can do with the default assumption that is that use and understanding go together in our minds automatically. I would like to know why this hypothesis would allow you to say, therefore, meaning has to do with the first person. Why not just the contrary? You could use the very same assumption, the default assumption, as a proof that there is no private meaning. That meaning is just that, what is acquired, through interaction with others, and there is no rest. So why would you say this default assumption is a proof that there is some interiority of meaning.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, when you get to the solution, you kind of dissolve the importance of the starting point. I suppose it's because the individual, I want to concentrate on the acquisition stage, and I just want to really sign up for the thing Davidson says about the individual endowing the word with meaning. And that does look very first personal, right?
Yes, but which acquisition stage are you? Are you saying you're selecting joint attention, right?
Sure.
But there is many other stages.
There are many other stages,
of
course, it's a big story. But in the early stages where you're endowing something with meaning and significance, you see, okay, here's why I'm doing it this way. I want to hold on to first-person authority about linguistic meaning. And it seems as though first-person authority is at first in tension with a kind of thesis about the objectivity of meaning. Because objectivity of meaning requires there to be a significant distinction between what you believe things to be and how they really are. And that's what objectivity requires, that there's a appreciable difference between having an opinion about something and it being right. But first-person authority, just as a phenomenon, seems to be where how you take things to be is how they are. And it's as if just taking them to be that way was enough for them to be that way. You know, it's a kind of Cartesian view about the mind. You know, if with me subjectively it's like this, that constitutes the reality of my mental states. So how can you put these things together? And I do want to have the conditions of joint attention and the conditions that involve others to get the objectivity, but I want the meaning something and knowing what the word means to be effortless, to be easy. So merely taking something to mean blah, 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 under these conditions is enough for me to be right. It does mean blah, blah, blah. Okay? And that does look like it's first person. If it was that I'm trying to, you know, latch onto something which is third personal or intercommunal in some way, it wouldn't be so obvious why we had first person authority, because it would seem as though we were always at risk as to whether how we took things to be really getting the communal stuff right, as if how we took things to be was good enough to know what the shared and social meanings were. So that's why does that help? I mean, I'm sensitive to your point, but that's...
It's a little bit question begging, because you impose such a very strong Cartesian condition that could be questioned by the people who are on that side.
Of course, there's something questioned. I mean, I'm not a Cartesian because I've got a kind of externalism about the mind in its joint attention stage. But look, there's something question begging against the Cartesian. You know, when the Cartesian says, you know, I believe I'm in pain. Means I'm in pain, and people say, "Oh, the trouble with Cartesianism is that, you know, there's no appreciable distinction between what you think about, you know, your mental states or your subjectivity." But of course, if you're getting your subjectivity right, your question begging against Cartesian, yeah, they are being presented with the objective facts. It's just they're subjectively available. So similarly, I want there just to be the first person take, my taking something to mean blah blah blah, and on occasions that can take me nowhere. I can have an impression of meaning, there isn't any. But I want to say that under the default conditions and the conditions of having taken a word to mean something in the right learning setup, it's enough. And it does get me out there to something. Once I've got something, you're right, I seem to participate in a sort of slightly communal situation. But remember, beyond the default assumption, I have to rein it back in, because now when I come across people in Edinburgh, Manchester, Sheffield, North London, South London, Oxford, you know, using words which I would use but having a significance they don't have for me, now I hear them as meaning such and such, but that isn't what they in fact mean, and I have to figure out what they do mean, that something's gone wrong. And I can only then, as it were, retreat to the sort of first personal basis, I think. But I'm sensitive to the way you want to stage the objection, yeah.
Well, my question is also, related to your default assumption and also to the question of how finally meanings are individuated. So here's what so the default assumption I read is anyone who uses W attaches the same meaning to W as the one that I attach. Now, suppose we take the word table and the meanings are very finely individuated in such a way that the meaning that I attach to it would lead me to see one instance as a table, whereas the meaning someone else's attaches maybe in some cases wouldn't lead him to conclude that something is a table. But still there is the majority of cases would overlap, so that in some sense we want to say that we mean more or less the same thing. And so my question is, would you rather, or the question is, why do you need a strong assumption that would say that we are entitled to think that anyone who uses W means the same thing as I, or rather a weaker assumption that would say something that, like, anyone who uses W means something sufficiently similar to what I mean to it. Now, the case you've made, it seems to me, is really a one where we have good reasons to take this weaker assumption for granted. But so would you insist that we need a stronger assumption, or would you maybe say that meaning should have a coarse-grained individuation rather than a one?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that really, maybe this helps me with Joelle, because it really depends on how fine-grained the individuation of meaning by me is. So if I have learned the use of the word table in a sort of small community, let's suppose I'm a rather kind of isolated child in an isolated community, and I learn the word table to be roughly the thing that we eat off, and not to see tables as available for other uses and lying around. It could be that among my small community of the faithful, I do attach this really rather restricted meaning. The default assumption is fine because everybody else attaches something like that restricted meaning too. And then going out into the wider world, people will start talking about tables. It seems to me that there's a sort of option at that point of me either kind of extending my use or thinking that we speak rather different languages and that table's slightly ambiguous. Okay, it's not obvious that there's a right or wrong way to go, but it might, if the juncture appeared, it might show that I've given a very fine individuation. On the other hand, I might have picked up, even from people who did have this rather restrictive view, a more general one, because I just didn't have as much determinacy in my take on what I thought we were jointly attending to, and I could extrapolate to other cases more easily. So again, it would sort of depend on what the individual's sort of initial setting was. And it's very hard to know what the calibration is. But it does look as though to get by in a wider linguistic community, it's better to think that we're roughly talking about the same objects, even if we're not thinking about them in the same ways. I mean, it's kind of like with proper names, the names might have a sense attached to them, and I might attach a sense, and you might attach another sense, and it doesn't matter as long as the reference is in common, we'll sort of get by. It might be that picture's more amenable when you go out into the wider world. The other option, of course, is that we don't understand each other as much as we think we do, and I think there's kind of lots of evidence of that as well. That I'm just taking it that nodding away wisely to what you were saying and thinking I've got your question entirely figured out, and probably missing some of the significance because there are bits of it that just don't mean, as you were expressing them, what I take them to mean. So there's a range of options. I need to think about what I want to say, but the weaker assumption is appealing, but it does seem to depend on what you latched on to begin with, whether it will come, whether the stronger assumption will have seemed to be in place because you'll come into tension with others at some points and usages. But you're going to say more.
Well, maybe there is an intermediate assumption, or one would say that you do understand what someone else means, even though if you were to spell out exactly the meaning that he attaches, exactly the meaning that you attach, but they are sufficiently close. And then sufficiently close, not precise.
No, but sufficiently close is okay as long now. But I suppose what I was trying to get to badly, I think I'm getting to it better now. Sufficiently close might not be that I think the meaning I attach is a sort of equivalence class of sufficiently close. The meaning I attach might be stronger, but as long as it is sufficiently close, then the default assumption isn't challenged or isn't seen to be overridden, and that might be okay. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, just wanted to ask you, in your handout at page 6, your 1-2 inference, they take you to mean M by the word W, and you mean M, you use the W, and 3. I mean, how mental, how inferential is this step? So I was told as a student of pragmatics that we share a code, and then we have some troubles, we have to make some effort in order to... and then you told us that it's even more difficult. Not only we have to work to make some work in order to come out with an interpretation, but we also need some inference in order to make the assumption that the other person
is using the words right.
So it's a kind of hyper-intentional Bayesian picture of...
Yeah, well, I was trying to, I see the worry, but I was trying to make that less hyper-intentional and sort of, calm the panic there by the looking-seeing analogy, because it seems to me in the looking-seeing analogy, there's a sort of switch from the first to the third person that one doesn't want. It's so automatic, one doesn't almost want to call it an inference, right? So, Sean's attention suddenly caught by something. I think, what's he seen? I look, oh, he's seen that person over there doing something funny. It's not as though I think, no, I'm doing a bit of inference. What has he seen? It doesn't feel inferential. It looks as though it's almost as simple as whatever process runs imitation, where in imitation you're going from what someone else is doing to what you do without inference. Although one could hyper-intentionalize that. You could say, Meltzoff's type experience, you could say, he's sticking out his tongue, that's in the middle of his face, I've got something, I've got something that feels like it's that shape, gee, this is probably the same thing, so I'll do that, that's probably... It doesn't work like that, of course. So equally, if the looking and seeing analogy and the moving from looking to seeing is so kind of, we're almost hardwired to do it, then it doesn't look to be so hyper-intentional. And I want the language case to borrow from that and to say we use similar first to third person connections as well.
Yes, but still you admit that you introduce a kind of further step of
it's a further step.
We have inference in order to get the intended meaning, and we have inference in order to get the fact that the person means the same thing with his or her word.
That's because there are no codes.
Is that this is very clear in the case of children, because when they learn words, they they attach meaning to the words. But in our case, as adults, in most of our experiences of comprehension, for example, reference fixing and understanding of the word are exactly the same. They are very parallel as processes. For example, if you tell me, I don't know, the microphone is on the table, my problem is to isolate this table, and so I have a sort of strong intuition that fixing the reference of your word table and understanding it are sort of parallel processes in my mind in order to get the interpretation. You don't have this kind of phenomenon, of very special phenomenon which you have in your learning of language, of hearing a sound and attaching
But I think, I'm not sure. See, I want to hold all that very complicated and sophisticated pragmatic stuff that you guys all do. I want to hold that in abeyance. I mean, if somebody says, if we hear a sentence, just sort of as if from God saying, the dwarf has gone to Munich, you know, we attach a significance that we think, what the hell does that mean? Who are they talking about? Why was that said? All those questions are still live, but we do know what we heard said. And it's what we heard said that I'm addressing. It's just what words were said, what words with what meanings were said. It leaves masses open at that stage, masses and masses and masses open, right? But we do know that was said, and not the train has gone to Munich, or you know, the dwarf has left for Zurich. I mean, it's getting at those things. See, it's a vice of my account. It's a vice of my account that if you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean and the wind is blowing really strongly, and it blows in such a way that you hear voices saying things, then on my account you do, and they have those meanings. Of course, we then do a little bit of inference and say, the wind isn't the person, it's not human, it's not animate, so it's not saying something to me, so it's not speaking. But I mean, although that's a kind of funny bullet I have to bite, that, you know, just noises, if I attach meaning to them, have those meanings. It does allow me to attach meanings to things like
you don't get any meaning in your account.
But you don't get any pragmatics on that.
I take anyone who uses W means what I mean by it, even the wind.
Even the wind.
Okay, so this
you've
is
got to say
an interesting extension.
It is an interesting extension, right? Even the wind. But of course, you wouldn't then do the pragmatics and say, gee, I wonder what the wind's talking about, or because you just know wind doesn't do that sort of thing. But it's a virtue of this funny thing I have to say, extension of meaning. That's why speech synthesizers, you know, that computer firms use for the telephone exchange, why it works. You see, when this funny voice says, you know, sorry, the number you have dialed is not available, and we hear that as meaning something. I think we're right to hear it as meaning something, and they mean us to hear it as meaning something, and everything goes swimmingly. For McDowell, that's got to be an illusion. It's got to be an illusion of meaning. Yes, it is. I'd ask them. That's got to be an illusion of meaning. Well, Charles knows his view better than McDowell, but McDowell says, okay, that's got to be an illusion of meaning. There's a failure there. We are hearing something because the meaning isn't on the surface of the words there. We hear it just the same, and then he's got to say, so this is an illusion. It's a sort of secondary case, and then he's got to tell a story, and then we don't want, you know, the lowest common, highest common factor, and blah 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 blah. I don't think there is an illusion there. I think everything's going just fine in that case. It doesn't go just fine for me when the wind is talking to me. That's a little uncomfortable. But telephone exchange is fine.
Yeah, I mean, two related points just about clarifying the reconciliation. It's not really clear what it is, how serious it is. There's a danger of conflating two dimensions, things not two dimensions. One is that sometimes you talk about words, what people mean by their words, and of course I mean what they mean by streams of words, sentences, arguments, things like that. And then you talk about knowing what W means, okay? Quite different. And the other thing is sort of the distinction between what you have in mind when you're speaking and what you have in mind about the language. You know, what part of what you have in mind has to do with the language, what has to do with your conceptualization of the situation, etc. Okay, so I want to just...
What do you mean by that? What's the
I'm going to try to focus on one issue. And if one thing is sure from the acquisition literature, the word acquisition, is that languages have very different meanings to be acquired, or something. Distinctions are very different from one language to another, and children are very good at acquiring distinctions. That seems to be well established in the literature. So if you learn a language that has only two color words, well, what you've basically got to know is that it doesn't matter, you know, that orange, you see something different when you see orange, you see red, okay, things like that. And if you have if you learn a language like Korean, where the closest equivalent of in, mention the distinction between tight fit and loose fit, you have to pay attention to that, and children do it very well before they're 2 years old. Okay, if you learn a language like English, you don't have to pay attention. So there's certainly something that English-speaking kids learn about, you know, the words that they have to learn in. It doesn't mean that English-speaking kids aren't interested in the difference between tight fit and loose fit, because later they're going to learn words like stuff and shove and things like that. So there seems to be some objective, at least everybody in the field seems to agree, that there are differences between language and that children have to acquire them. Okay? And they do that on the basis of the models, etc. No matter whether they're interested in orange or red, if the language doesn't give them any means of talking about it, they're not going to learn any means of talking about it. They'll have to invent one when they get older. Okay? So they really, that seems to be objective, right? It's their environment that's leading them, you know, to decide what's relevant, you know, to using a certain word or not another word.
But what is it you're saying that's at all problematic for me? Because I mean,
but that's the linguistic aspect.
Because if what you're saying is that the people we interact with and the kind of experiences that we try to coordinate our minds to with others are kind of very particular to the experiences that they've also had with other people, and that they're in community with.
My mind.
Yes, it is. It's all right.
I mean, suppose I speak one of these languages, I just want to make it
take tight fit, loose fit, whatever. I mean, look, there are certain things that some communities of people might be paying attention to, right? And as you said, doesn't matter if you took an English child and brought it up in Korea, or a Korean child and brought it up here. So who you're actually interacting with, the things they care about, the needs, perceptions, saliences of those people are going to have a very big influence on which experiences you choose to focus on and communicate to one another. All of that, no, but I'm saying that. And all of that's entirely compatible with everything you are saying. So I'm struggling to see
I'm saying
why
that
you think
if you speak a language that, for instance, let's
problematic.
take a very simple case. You suppose you speak a language that has only two color words, the light and dark colors.
Yeah.
Well, no matter, you might be very interested in and the people you're talking to might be very interested in the difference between orange and red. But when you use those two words, you know, it doesn't matter. So what you've got to know is about what the meaning or the use conditions of those two words are. If you want to talk about the difference between the orange bird and the red bird, you have to talk about it in some other way.
Right.
And that's part of what you learn. Right. So one of the things you're aware of when you're using.
So what you're saying is you've got to be aware of what the other person is trying to get you to focus on when using that word. Sure.
No,
I'm signed up for
not
that.
at all.
Yeah.
It doesn't. If you know that language, you know it doesn't matter.
What do you mean if you know that
word.
language? What's
I mean,
this
if you
knowing
know
that
a language,
Now we're back to this knowing
if the
language
person
stuff.
says mealy, and mealy means anything that's dark colored,
Yeah.
something like that. Well, then you know if he uses mealy, it doesn't matter for him, you know, for the use of that word. He said, look at that mealy thing over there. Okay, that's enough to distinguish the mealy thing from the molar. But if he wants to say, look at that thing, and it's orange rather than red or green rather than blue, he has to use some other words. That's a fact you know about the language. And the question is really how much of linguistic knowledge is like that?
No. You say something which is perfectly fine, and then you add, and that's a fact about the language, and you know that.
Yeah.
That's just doing no work at all.
Why is it doing
It's
more
just
than all?
doing no work at all. Because everything that we're talking about, where the speakers are in communication, can be explained in along similar lines to the ones I'm explaining, and then you add, and that's a fact about the language, and that's a fact that they know. And I think that's a theorist's point of view. So that you can talk about what people are actually doing, what conditions their minds are in, how they're interacting with each other, how their minds are configured with each other, various uses and understandings they're giving to terms, and then you add this extra kind of level. You say, and these are facts about the language and they know them. And then you kind of want to make the illicit move to suggest that these facts are somehow primary and that our knowledge of them, got somehow, how, question mark, is actually what's driving the actual interactions that are taking place between two people when they use words with one another. And I just don't see, where the knowledge of these, what these facts consist in, what the knowledge of these facts is such that they were acquired by these children pre-2, and also what role supposed knowledge of these facts is doing to explain what's actually going on between two people who are succeeding in communicating. Don't need it. Don't need it. It's just redundant.
Right. I mean, if you're talking about linguistic meanings, right? At one point, sometimes you're talking about what children learn in the acquisition situation.
I'm talking about children investing or endowing sounds with meaning.
Okay, so now there's a situation where he just has a two-way distinction, two sounds. and they cover, say, one of them covers half the colors you can see, and the other covers the other one, okay? And there's going to be an indeterminate boundary between us. That's the way language works, okay? Now, you're going to try to give an objective description of what... Right. Well, no, wait, no, we're not talking about how they communicate.
Yeah, we
might be very interested in talking about the difference between orange and red.
When you
but
talk
they have to use different ways of
when you
talking
talk about the language, this is a theorist's kind of extrapolation, which you then kind of reify into these sets of facts, and then you mysteriously believe that somehow the speakers have knowledge of these facts, how, question mark, and then the knowledge of these facts is what's actually explanatory and what they're actually doing with each other. I just don't see it's needed, and I don't think you can have it for a start.
So you would disagree with everybody who studies acquisition? Because
No, I don't. Everybody. This isn't an appeal to authority. It's not everybody believes that. There are also acquisition theorists who think this way.
Who think which way? I mean, they think that any acquisition theorist would look at the children learning a language, and he wants to explain, for instance, why, children speaking a certain language that has more distinctions and more lexical distinctions, and respect those lexical distinctions, than children who speak another language that doesn't.
Sure, because of the people they're interacting with.
Yeah,
that's the primary fact. The talk of the language is actually a sort of later extrapolation. The primary fact is just who they're interacting with, what those people are doing. It's just what those people are doing. We don't need the language.
Very briefly, I'd like to ask you about the scope of the default assumption, and in fact, about also the scope of the looking, seeing analogy as a basic strategy for justifying the default assumption. And basically, the question I have is really how you respond to Quine's basic challenge of distinguishing meanings from beliefs. So it seems to me that the cases where your default assumption really makes sense is precisely where the analogy, the looking, seeing analogy holds, and that's some strong grip. But think about cases where people disagree strongly about whether the word has a reference, for example, where as soon as beliefs, different individuals' beliefs might interact with actual use of words, then how, think of words like God, like evil, like ghost and witch and so on. I mean, what's really the scope of the default assumption?
I do think those sorts of cases do come late. I mean, they do come much later, and I'm feeling my way to the sort of very early stage. I think if you weren't brought up amongst a community of people whose beliefs were sort of sufficiently overlapping with you, then it would be very, very difficult. And you would, as if you would get into the Quinean problem straight away. But actually, remember that the epistemology is supposed to be that if 3 wasn't the cornerstone of the little practice of people talking to each other, the practice wouldn't exist. Now, built into that could be the sorts of things that you're alluding to, that there must be enough parity of belief or congruence of belief or sharing of belief within a certain setting. And then beyond that, of course, things will break down and the default assumption won't hold. I mean, case of words without reference is...
Well, there's agreement.
Yeah, right, but those are tricky, because, I think those are tricky, because you certainly know what the person means. What you're disagreeing about is whether what they mean has come to be or was always in being or something, but you know what they mean. So there's a kind of sharing you could be disagreeing about, you know who you're talking about, and there's a question of fact. It might be a question of fact whether there's denotation for some of these terms, but on questions of meaning, we think we know what other people mean. Otherwise, religious debate is even less sensical than it sometimes seems. But I still want to say those things are quite late. I think it's a crime that people teach children about Santa Claus as if he exists. It's just a linguistic crime, You shouldn't do that to children. It takes children forever to learn there's no Santa Claus and get really they talked about this guy, they put biscuits out from his stuff, This is just epistemologically dangerous. We shouldn't do it. I won't ever do it, my children, but poor children. But so I do think these are very special cases. They may come late, and the default assumption sometimes has to be overruled. But I'm wondering whether it does, or whether these are just further debates about fact, and we can actually stabilize meaning a bit more and have less of the Quinean kind of feeling that belief and meaning have to, force no agreement about what words mean. I might want more of a divide between belief and meaning than that. But thanks, I'll think about that.
Yes. So you said that you wanted to solve the reconciliation problem, which is how can meanings that are in the mind be publicly accessible to others? And can your answer be summed up as in two claims? One is that everybody is making the assumption by default that the others have the same meanings, attach the same meanings as they do. And then why does this work? Well, it works because actually people attach more or less the same meanings to the words because of the learning situation. So is that a fair...
What could be simpler than that?
Okay.
Right, but notice that in saying that, I'm slightly changing the advertised story, because by publicly accessible now, we don't really mean they're kind of observable on the surface, right? That's not, so publicly accessible, publicity is being re-described in this minimal way that others can know what you mean. And that was sort of important. I mean, maybe that again helps Joelle to see why it's first personal, because it really is saying there isn't a kind of, they aren't really publicly accessible. There are only the meanings each of us attaches to the words that we hear, but under certain conditions, that's okay. We will still succeed in knowing what other people mean.
Mine is just a question of clarification too, because I'm about the default assumption. I'm trying to understand what cases those assumptions apply to. So sometimes you say that this is the case for children when they're learning a language. Sometimes I think I've heard you say this is the case for adults when they're normally speaking a language.
Yes.
And then sometimes you make this other claim that we couldn't communicate with one another at all unless we were all making this assumption.
Unless we had made that assumption in the initial stages, there wouldn't have been a practice getting learning. As children learning, right? Sorry, that's
so are you making all three of those claims?
No, not the third, because it's the third, as long as it's qualified as unless that assumption had held in the learning situation, there wouldn't have been a practice. Then what happens? Interesting. Then what happens is you kind of keep the default assumption going some places and not others. I mean, so it sort of. You're right, it starts as adults. You start to have it kind of largely except here, or largely except him, or largely except him when he's talking about this, or largely except when she says da. So it's true that I think the natural psychological state is to use it and then to modify it and keep track of the modifications and keep track of the places where it's overridden. And also, I mean, that's the sad fact about us going into stores in foreign countries and just saying, do you have one of these, and hoping it all works. You just do it.
So for the case of the children or the language users, then that's really the sort of first case.
That's the first case.
And in that case, it is a phenomenological claim. Is that right? That it's phenomenologically true from the language learner's point of view that he takes his words to mean such and such in speaking, and that he immediately hears others to mean such and such.
That sound just has that meaning. When he, but when you learned it and invested it with meaning, it now has a sort of inside as well as an outside. It's not just a sound. It's got some experiential dimension to it. And whenever that comes up, out of my lips, out of another person's, that's what it has. It comes with that experience attached.
But once you have that experience, it's because you've already learned the meanings of the words, right? If you're really interested in the case where you're...
Don't have to say that. You just don't have to say that.
But if you're really interested in the case where you're acquiring the meaning, it seems to me you don't just take your words to mean such and such. You sort of wonder whether they do. I mean, I try this out in the stores all the time. I'm going to use this word. I wonder what it's going to turn out to mean.
But that's very sophisticated later. I mean, I go back to Dan's thought that people don't usually wonder what their words mean. I mean, some people will never do it in their life.
But learners do.
Yeah, but Well,
I
is
think
that
children
right?
try out
Is
words all
that
the time,
is
don't they?
is that right? Is that right? I mean, there's a lot of evidence that children don't do that kind of trying out. That they kind of latch onto something. They say something. They either get away with it, and everything's going fine, or else then they have to start doing some kind of paddling around. And also, children latch onto. Notice that children latch onto meanings of words which other people have to drag them away from, because they say cow, and they say, that's right, darling, that's cow, and then they see horse, cow, no, and they see a cat, cow, no, that's a cat, that's a, so you kind of chop it up and refine it and sort of package it and represent it in just the places you want it. But I don't think the child sort of thinks when it says cow, is that a cow? How am I doing? Shall I try something else? I think that's too reflective. I guess, but we'd have to talk to the professionals.
So, but then it is an empirical claim.
Yeah.
It's an empirical claim about what it's like to learn a language.
Well, when you say what it's like, that was phenomenological.
Yeah.
Right. But an empirical claim about the phenomenological, it's just taking it like that. Yeah, it's just a take.
So in order to argue against the claim, you'd have to have sort of empirical evidence that phenomenologically.
Well,
learning
no, I
is
mean, you could undermine that, but you might philosophically hate the epistemology, and dear God, there are many people who do. Or you might start talking about these facts, the language, and somehow that's got to be got at first, or even knowledge of the language, whatever that is, has got to be kind of got at.
Within the constraints of your claim.
Yeah.
You would count as sort of inside our attack on the view.
Yeah.
That helps. Thanks.
Right. Well, I won't say what I was going to say, but I'll just follow on
Sean.
Sean was saying. I mean, I think you're right there that I speak from a uniquely privileged position, having a 3-year-old, and so watching a lot of language learning going on. At the acquisition stage, children are doing both things. There's both just getting a hold of a word and attaching a meaning to it, taking it to mean something.
Yeah.
Without hesitation and experimentation, and also the groping, as it were, using a word, seeing what response it gets, seeing if the use conditions that the child's going to be thinking in those terms that are assumed bring success. There's my little boy, there's a wonderful case, I think, that illustrates your argument on page 6, or rather your description, to do with Paris, just meaning the word Paris. Before we came to Paris, or before we came for this long stay, he visited several times our flat, and in order to prepare him for this long stay, I asked several questions. Where do we play when we're in Paris? The plastic Vosges, as he calls it. Where do we have breakfast? Shape Hall. Where do we do, etc., etc. So we agreed with all of these.
Nice time he's having.
So we had to, so I thought I had acquainted him with the idea that we're going to Paris. When we arrived, for a couple of days, there was tremendous confusion because he kept saying, when are we going to get to Paris? This was happening. I'd say, I want to go back to Paris. And I'd say, but we're in Paris, this is Paris, and so on. And I finally realized that he was using the word Paris to mean Place du Marché Saint-Catherine, just the little place where our flat is. I was using the word Paris to mean the region within Paris, right? Now, one might also say there's a fact about what the word Paris means, and that this fact is enshrined in dictionaries and so on. Okay?
There are a bunch of opinionated people who write dictionaries. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. But I'm not sure that you can't allow.
Well, we could do all the horrible Chomsky stuff if Paris was blown up in a nuclear, and they moved it to,
I'm not sure that's going to be very worrying if you were to allow, in some sense, that there are facts about what words mean, that these facts are enshrined.
I think those facts about what words mean eventually can all be, in a complicated way, broken down into facts about what individuals take themselves and other people to. That's all I want to say.
I mean,
sure. But I think I can do that.
Oh, right. Even if we grant in some sense that there are facts about linguistic meaning, facts in that sense don't play any explanatory role.
Right.
Okay. You just say that, without taking on that. That argument.
Okay. Good.
That's another case
that
you might have to argue, but you don't have to make. You have that argument in hand in order to say, look, they don't play any explanatory role in vis-a-vis what I'm trying to explain here. I'll just give the other example for Sean's question. At a restaurant, he shed his boots, and there's a lot of talk about what one does in cafes and restaurants and what one doesn't at 3. And I said, well, it's not the done thing. The man, there's this ambiguous figure of the man in every restaurant. The man isn't going to like that. They're just supposed to wear your shoes in the restaurant. And I said, but don't worry, we can discreetly put them back on before we leave. And so the next day, he spilled some water. And he said, the man isn't going to like that. And then he said, shall I discreetly wipe it off? and he was looking, and then he looked at me and he said, discreetly. And he was obviously checking out, because he only got hold of that once. He wasn't quite sure. He thought he'd try, because it was a sufficiently similar situation, etc. And I think that both things happened. He thought he got hold of the meaning of Paris, and he and I successfully communicated for quite a long time. Till we realized that our meanings diverged. He found out that his target communicator didn't mean at all.
But when he was
assuming
when he said, when are we going to Paris and all the rest, he was very happy and everything.
And I was assuming that he meant by Paris what I meant. So the assumption was in place, the assumption of successful communication went on to a point, then it became clear that our conceptions attaching to Paris differed, communication broke down, and then we had to renegotiate meanings. We now mean by Paris plus too much this
just had to mean that. But thanks. Those are both distinctions are very useful. That there are two things that get done, and that even if other people want those facts, I can just let them have them, and then say they don't play an explanatory role.
Thank you very much once again. I'm afraid we have to stop. We have many more questions, but we have another seminar at 3 where Joël will be talking about metacognition and meta-representation, knowing one's own mind, but not of language, emergent of consciousness. And the next seminar here in the morning will be by Tim Crane on the 26th, 26 November. Tim Crane will speak on the efficacy of color, shape, and size.